moderator, Jeffrey motherfucking Homicide, and your commander, Alfie Schwartz.
Alfie. Yeah, how's it going?
Oh, pretty good. Pretty bad.
Pretty bad. It's, what's the day today? It's December 6th, 2015. Already. So, what the fuck did I just watch?
Was it a speech?
Obama gave a kind of a rare address from the Oval Office concerning not just the event in San Bernardino, but more encompassing issues regarding international terrorism and gun control, actually linking them. In fact, he ruled the San Bernardino incident as a international terrorist attack.
I don't know. He didn't exactly rule it a international terror attack. He accepted that there is some link in the spread of an ideology.
That's right, but he did call it an act of terrorism.
Yes, he did.
And you could call anything an act of terrorism, but he labeled this one specifically an act of terrorism. I guess the disconcerting thing about this is gun control is now linked to international terrorism, or I guess that's where they're trying to scope everybody's consciousness so they could carry out more attacks in Syria and have more gun control.
Yes, that seems to be something going on in the text of that speech. We see the same thing from a certain New York Times editorial that's been circulating recently, but we'll get to that later.
Yeah, I mean, it's just right after the San Bernardino attack, he's constantly been saying that everybody's becoming numb to these attacks. It's gotten to a point where I just don't give much of a fuck every time something like this happens, because it happens so often. And I mean, frankly, a lot of it seems kind of contrived and planned out, but that's a whole nother show that we can get into. If anything, I'm numb from all the fake bullshit that comes from it, especially when you see a lot of the, jumbled up cell phone videos and the wishy-washy helicopter videos and, the crisis actors. It just seems really contrived to me.
Yeah, I think we're all getting tired of the hypocrisy involved in politics these days. Sticking to the text of Obama's speech tonight, it was there's a quote where he says, "Freedom is more powerful than fear." But what we're doing, the message we're actually sending through our actions, is that we're going to have to curtail your freedom to assuage your fears. With his actual mouth, he's saying freedom is more powerful than fear, but his legislative course is based in fear, not based in freedom. Because he's talking about how we have to take certain rights of gun ownership away because of the proliferation of mass shootings in this culture, and using that as a justification why we can't be free. So I think there's a huge hypocrisy there that's part of the larger hypocrisy that we keep witnessing from leadership these days. He said nothing in his speech about what in society causes people to become violent. If we just take away aspects of the Bill of Rights and do nothing to stem the tide of heinous killers in today's society, then it doesn't matter what technology is available to the diseased mind. They will still find ways to be harmful. These speeches never want to address the proliferation of murderous individuals in society, why there are so many people willing to use violence in pursuit of a political or social agenda. And people don't want to try to answer that question because they have to face up to the institutional, cultural, and philosophical violence that surrounds us. The physical discipline that we force our children to internalize at a young age, the violence our country wages as a matter of routine, the operant conditioning of B.F. Skinner that's so widely used to instill social values through the use of punishment and threats of punishment. We don't want to look at these things. We don't want to re-examine these things because so much of our shared nation is built upon these sicknesses.
Hmm.
And so it follows that people are going to accept that the violence done unto them and the violence done unto others is just. So then we internalize the value that we can use physical violence in the cause of justice. And that's what we see people assuming is possible today when they shoot a group of innocent individuals based on some grudge that's in their head and speaking to them so loudly that they have to harm other people. They feel that their particular use of violence is just because they learned somewhere back in the day that violence has value in society. It's a pattern that renders empathy non-existent. And empathy and sympathy are what stop 99% of people from killing other people. And empathy and sympathy are what those who do kill other people, it's what they're probably most lacking. And that's what needs to change first. It's not the amount of technology available to someone bearing that much ill will. It's about the fact that people are carrying around that much ill will in the first place. That's what needs to be addressed, it seems. And something like that would possibly be easier to accomplish than firearms prohibition. And it carries fewer negative side effects than attempting measures of gun prohibition. I mentioned B.F. Skinner. He was a psychologist or psychiatrist, and he came up with the idea of modifying an individual's behaviors by punishing them at certain times, rewarding them at other times, withholding certain things until the desired behavior is enacted or internalized. And when you talk about that, you're describing our education system, the way we parent, and you're describing the way we treat people who break the law. These are all behavioral conditioning models. Mass media is another behavioral conditioning model. Skinner himself was condemned as a proponent of totalitarian thinking and as an advocate of a rigidly managed social environment. I don't know about you, but I don't trust any managers enough to appoint them arbiters of the human psyche.
What's his full name?
BF.
Skinner?
Bad fella.
Bad fella Skinner? What's he all about? Who's he?
His most famous experiment is called the Skinner box. It permits experimenters to study behavior conditioning by teaching a subject animal to perform certain actions in response to specific stimuli. His work carried on from the work of Pavlov, who got the dog to salivate exactly with the stimuli of a piece of meat. Society has become essentially a large-scale Skinner box, and we are, like trained animals, becoming violent in response to specific stimuli as well. This is a quote from Alice Miller.
People whose integrity has not been damaged in childhood, who were protected, respected, and treated with honesty by their parents, will be both in their youth and in adulthood intelligent, responsive, empathic, and highly sensitive. They will take pleasure in life and will not feel any need to kill or even hurt others or themselves. They will use their power to defend themselves, not to attack others. They will not be able to do otherwise than respect and protect those weaker than themselves, including their own children, because this is what they have learned from their own experience, and because it is this knowledge, and not the experience of cruelty, that has been stored up inside them from the beginning. It will be inconceivable to such people that earlier generations had to build up a gigantic war industry in order to feel comfortable and safe in this world, since it will not be their unconscious drive in life to ward off intimidation experienced at a very early age. They will be able to deal with attempts at intimidation in their adult life more rationally and creatively.
And I think what we're seeing today in the New York Times and in Barack Obama's speech, that we are not able to deal with attempts at intimidation in our adult lives rationally or creatively, because our integrity has been damaged in childhood. We were not protected, respected, and treated honestly by our parents or other adult figures in our life, be it teachers, administrators of schools, false role models, a range of things that have enabled this gigantic war industry for us to feel comfortable and safe in this world. There's been so much we've experienced and had to internalize.
Definitely. I think a lot of what you're saying is the way to talk about these things. It has everything to do with the human psyche. There's that saying that, guns, they don't kill people, just like pencils don't misspell words. A gun is like it's an inanimate fucking object.
You're an inanimate fucking object.
And I love that movie. Yeah, I mean, going back to the New York Times article and the gun epidemic in America by the editorial board. That's what you're referring to, right?
Indeed.
Motives do not matter to the dead in California, nor did they in Colorado, Oregon, South Carolina, Virginia, Connecticut, and far too many other places.
What they leave out is that motives should and do matter to the living people.
Absolutely.
Not only in California, not only in Colorado, but worldwide. Anyone who doesn't want to see this kind of bullshit keep happening, where people keep taking so many lives for petty-ass, childish reasons.
Well, I mean, if we want to talk about gun control, and I know I've mentioned this before, think of all the mass killings overseas by our government with all the weapons that they have. And you could take it a step further if you want to talk about civilians carrying weapons. I mean,
right.
Look at fucking Blackwater. I mean, that's a civilian army right
absolutely.
there.
Yeah. Do motives matter to the dead in Iraq and Afghanistan and Pakistan? I think probably those motives matter a great deal to them because they want to know why this is happening.
It's fucking crazy. You have people saying, well, civilians don't have tanks or missiles, and then you could be like, yeah, they do.
Absolutely. Yep.
It's an easy argument to shoot down.
But what they're wanting you to do, though, is to leave motive out of the conversation so we don't actually talk about why this is happening. It's an attempt to avoid the whole discussion we've started having here.
Yeah, that's definitely the worst parts about it.
Because and then in the very next sentence afterwards, it purports to be able to tell its readership that
the attention and anger of Americans should also be directed at the leaders whose job it is to keep us safe, but who place a higher premium on the money and political power of an industry dedicated to profiting from the unfettered spread of ever more powerful firearms.
So what they're saying is that don't care about the motives. Here's where your attention should go. Here's where your anger should go. And it just so happens to be people that the New York Times already has an agenda against. And I object to the notion that it's the elected leaders whose job it is to keep us safe. If I was in a room full of our elected leaders, I would not feel very safe around these people.
No.
It is each person's own job to keep themselves and their loved ones safe. Before it's the job of a bunch of people you've never met, never will meet, and can't even get a hold of if you wanted to. It's just such a weird approach to a very complicated problem.
I don't know what time it is
in New York these days.
The article closes off pretty interestingly.
There's one more thing before the end of the article, where it says,
it is not necessary to debate the peculiar wording of the Second Amendment.
Which, as a sentence, is absurd. So you're acknowledging that there's a complicated issue going on that needs fixing, and you're saying that we can't have a debate about certain things. Some things have to be left out of debate because your editorial staff has deemed them not necessary. It may not be necessary for you because that's not a debate you want to have, New York Times. But the sentence that follows after it is also fairly revealing.
No right is unlimited and immune from reasonable regulation.
If that is how you feel about the rights and the Bill of Rights and the Constitution, then certainly that's the debate to have, I think. Because if you interpret the phrase shall not be infringed to mean, yeah, you could infringe that, then there's something weird going on in your attitude towards constitutional government, and I think I'd like to have a conversation about it. And if you actually look at the wording of the Second Amendment, there's an independent clause and a dependent clause. It's not really that peculiar of a sentence. The first half says,
the word amendment itself is like, I mean, you can change it.
Well, yeah, you can change it through a constitutional process. You can appeal. You can add amendments and remove amendments from the Constitution. But when that amendment is in place, it is binding. And if it says shall not be infringed, then as long as there is that amendment and it has not been removed, then that right and law shall not be infringed. Then here's the dependent clause. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. So the independent clause here, the part of the sentence that could stand alone without that dependent clause. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. It's simple grammar. None of these words are that peculiar for today's English. I hear most of them on a semi-regular basis. So to call it peculiar wording and to say that no debate about it is necessary when you are writing editorials to controvert it, I see what you're doing. And I see what kind of sophistry is being used on the American people. It's nothing new, but it's always annoying. And then there's the sentence at the end.
Certain kinds of weapons, like the slightly modified combat rifles used in California, and certain kinds of ammunition must be outlawed for civilian ownership. It is possible to define those guns in a clear and effective way, and yes, it would require Americans who own those kinds of weapons to give them up for good of their fellow citizens.
Wow.
What better time than during a presidential election to show at long last that our nation has retained its sense of decency?
Yeah. Yeah, this appeared on the front page, and it's the first time an editorial has appeared on the front page since 1920. An article like this, plus the presidential address today, has me worried a little.
How are we going to show people that we've retained our sense of decency when we aren't retaining any of our decent principles that got us here? I understand that there are certain things about our founding principles that we've gotten rid of for very good reasons. But the more and more time goes on, the less and less of our founding principles we have retained. The First Amendment isn't what it used to be. The Second Amendment isn't what it used to be. The Fourth Amendment isn't what it used to be. So on and so forth. Has decency really changed that much from the Enlightenment principles that are still very valuable to this day? If those are indecent these days, then I, like you, do have a bit of concern for these developments and going down this path much further. To me, the urge to restrict the Second Amendment in the wake of a tragedy is also the urge to express our collective emotions through legislation. And expressing emotion through legislation is ill-conceived. There are many risks to doing so, one of which is the obfuscation of the dangerous pathology's existential roots. Why are people violent? Why does America seem to have so many more violent people doing these things? Not about what technology are they using to do it. That is kind of a secondary or tertiary concern, because a dangerous pathology is dangerous even without a firearm. And as soon as we get the next round of gun legislation, we'll have the problem-solved attitude and political belief, regardless of the effects of that legislation. The same way people feel about the Affordable Care Act now. They feel that the healthcare system has been reformed. Ta-da, job's done. The government passed a bill about it. And it'll be about 15 to 20 years at the earliest before another reform is possible in either the healthcare system or in firearm reform. And imagine how hard it's going to be to get firearms back if they are gone.
Oh man, yeah.
If this turns out to be a mistake, we won't be able to get Congress to pass a gun freedom bill. So we have to be very careful about letting go of certain rights, or any rights really, because it's much harder to get them back once you have given them up. And there needs to be a debate about motive, a debate about constitutional amendments. Before we do anything rash out of fear and anxiety, we need to have a conversation as a nation before we can go down a road that we can't come back from very easily.
Definitely.
In the meantime, everybody should get buy a AR-15 rifle. Everybody get one for your baby, get one for your mommy, for your daddy.
I'm just playing. I'm not going to buy one. I do have a few guns. Look, Shorts and I aren't gun-toting crazy people. Speaking for myself, I don't really care for guns. I don't like guns. I have a few, but every now and then I'll go hunting. You know, I don't do it a lot, maybe once every 2 years. It's like a good spiritual exercise. You know, if I know I'm going to eat my prey, I'll do it. I don't do it often. I'm not one of those people that likes to take pictures of the prey they killed, have them hang up and stand by it and smile. I even feel weird about that with fish. You know, a lot of people do that. And that's normal, but it's not in my personality to do that, because I feel that's like kind of disrespectful to the prey. It's kind of like putting a thumbs up next to a dead Iraqi. You know, it's not my thing. Do you have any guns, Shorts?
I don't even own a gun, let alone many guns that would necessitate an entire rack.
No, I don't have any guns.
Yeah, so this is even ridiculous to people who don't really own guns. It's really easy to see through. So we're talking about the human psyche and the ridiculousness of this whole thing. What is the agenda here? Why would they want guns taken away?
Ostensibly for the same reasons that authoritarian regimes have always wanted to remove the ability of their subjects to resist if the eventuality presented itself. But I'm not a pro-gun person. I mean, I think not being completely unarmed relative to a very powerful state enterprise is necessary for the sustainability and vitality of a free state. Because there's one thing about freedom I've learned, is that there's always someone who wants to either take it from you or convince you that you don't have any. So I personally don't use guns for liberation, but that certainly has happened in history. It would be ludicrous to assume that it's never happened. There's clearly truth to that. But I don't want to make it about the guns issue. I mean, I think it's helpful to point out how things are being politicized immediately. As soon as something goes wrong, there's a list of politicians and makeup crew ready to take advantage of the whole thing. But it's not really, to me, about guns. That's one level. The other level, which I think is much more meaningful to pursue, is still the inquiry on why people become so violent. I know a lot of people, and I don't know anyone who has ever done a mass shooting. So certainly we know that it's possible for people to go through life and never pick up a gun and shoot anybody. What we don't know is why some people still do that. Why it's not everybody who doesn't go through life without picking up guns and killing each other. And if we have that discussion, we'll get somewhere. If we don't have that discussion, we'll get nowhere.
So that being said, do you think that there is the whole range of possibility, and it's hard for me to avoid glossing over, but like I said, we can get into it in another show. There's a whole possibility that these attacks could very well be manufactured, but do you think America has a problem with violence in its society than any other country on Earth? Because you have people pulling these statistics out, and I guess these are all gun-related deaths, but the numbers are pretty stark compared to other countries. Do you think America is a more violent society, and that's why the numbers are so high?
But violence goes a lot beyond violent crime to me. If you took a survey of people who've been convicted of violent crime, I'd be very surprised if less than 95% of them were badly abused as children. It's one thing to punch an adult. For that, you go to jail. But if you wallop on a kid, spankings or even verbal violence, why these things are okay. We've got a very robust double standard on how and when violence can be used and on whom it can be used.
Would you ever hit your kids?
Oh, hell no. Hell no. There's no freaking reason for it. You couldn't find anything more defenseless than a kid. You have to be a sadist to think that you're going to help your child by hurting it.
Oh, man, I got my ass whooped. Like, big time. You never got your ass whooped?
I was spanked one time, and my dad felt very bad and didn't do it anymore. I know he got it bad from his dad when he was growing up. His dad was a drill sergeant. But my dad luckily broke the cycle of handing that shit down to your kids, and I'm very thankful for that.
Yeah.
Because studies have shown just how bad spanking is for children, and how bad operant conditioning in general as a parenting strategy, how dangerous these things are for children. It can lower a child's IQ by up to 10 points.
Man, no wonder I'm such a fucking dumbass.
It causes a lack of empathy, as like we were talking about earlier. with the Alice Miller stuff. People whose integrity has not been damaged in childhood,
Fuck.
protected, treated with honesty by their parents, will be empathic and highly sensitive. And people who don't, people who've never seen empathic or sensitive behavior modeled for them by an adult that they looked up to, these people will have almost no chance to become peaceful and highly sensitive themselves. People who've been conditioned through violence will end up conditioning others through violence. The other side of it is that if people are not taught to be sensitive and have empathy for others and to sympathize, then what conditioning will they be receiving instead? It's not all that mysterious once we start having the conversation, I think.
I mean, that doesn't apply to everybody, but those are good points. It kind of depends on how big your mom are. Like, when I was 10 years old, like, I was still getting hit, and I just started laughing and, like, thought it was funny. It just didn't hurt anymore.
Sure,
and
yeah.
I stopped.
It didn't hurt anymore, but it did before you were 10. That's when she stopped, right? That's when it didn't work anymore?
No, actually it wasn't 10. I was still young. I think it was 15. You know, yeah, I think it was when, like, Fight Club came out. Because that movie had a lot of influence on me. There's this one scene where Brad Pitt is, like, on the ground and he's getting, like, the shit beat out of him by a mobster, and he's just, like, he's getting pounded in the face. He's not hitting back or anything. All he's doing really is laughing. He's, like, embracing the pain. Like, he's sort of learning to, I guess not say learning to love it, but, like, he's not, it doesn't really faze him. Like, he's lost that sort of sensitivity because he's got punched in the face one too many times. And then that in itself is, like, how I reacted to one beating when my mom was going at me with a hanger. And it just broke apart, and then she got another one, and it broke apart. Then she got some nunchucks. That's when it got really funny. I mean, they just happened to be laying around somewhere in my room.
Yeah,
I mean, it's not like she kept them, like, stashed away somewhere.
These are for the kids.
In a cabinet. But no, like, it was. I just, you know, you lose the fear eventually.
You do lose the fear when you're not so helpless and defenseless anymore, but you don't lose the pain.
In some cases, it can kind of toughen you up.
It definitely toughens you up, but then there's matters of degrees to which it toughens certain people up.
Yeah.
Certain people, it can toughen up a slight amount to a few things, but some people, it ends up being so bad that it toughens them up so they don't feel anything. The brain does that. When your pain level is so high for so long, the part of your brain that feels pain starts to shut down as a coping mechanism. So if you can't feel anything for yourself, you're not going to be able to feel anything for other people. That is the epidemic we're seeing. And it's not necessarily a case of firearms. It's a case of complex social forces and the ways we are internalizing a broken value system.
I think we're the most drugged up country.
Absolutely. We are the most mentally ill country in the history of drugged up countries.
A lot of these shooters have a history of mental illness and a history of taking these antidepressants. I forgot the name of them. Starts with an M.
MAOI.
Yes.
And also the SSRIs, the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors.
I think that's what I'm talking about, yeah.
One of the best websites on the internet is a database called ssristories.org. It describes itself as a collection of over 5,000 news stories with full media articles available, mostly criminal in nature, that have appeared in the media or that were part of FDA testimony between 1991 and 2006, in which antidepressants are mentioned, or in some cases family, friends, law enforcement officers, or coroners have verified the presence of an antidepressant in a perpetrator. And in many cases, the defendants were found not guilty because of adverse effects from the antidepressants. Whether that's a function of a broken legal system or whether it's a function of the true culpability of pharmaceutical drugs is another debate for another time. But it's still interesting to note that in courts of law, drugs have been found guilty of murder. So you look at one of the drugs people go to when they're feeling mentally unwell. One of those things that causes people to do shootings and to take their own life as well. Wow, how is the problem going to get better when the support system has a side effect including violent crime? Alice Miller was a psychotherapist for many years, I think 20 or more, and then she kind of quit to go her own way with her thinking. She wrote that
in the same decade in which writers are discovering the emotional importance of childhood and are unmasking the devastating consequences of the way power is secretly exercised under the disguise of child-rearing, students of psychology are spending 4 years at universities learning to regard human beings as machines in order to gain a better understanding of how they function. When we consider how much time and energy is devoted during these best years to wasting the last opportunities of adolescence and to suppressing, by means of the intellectual disciplines, the feelings that emerge with particular force at this age, then it is no wonder that the people who have made this sacrifice victimize their patients and clients in turn, treating them as mere objects of knowledge instead of as autonomous creative beings. There are some authors of so-called objective, scientific publications in the field of psychology who remind me of the officer in Kafka's penal colony with their zeal and consistent self-destructiveness. In the unsuspecting, trusting attitude of Kafka's convicted prisoner, on the other hand, we can see the students of today who are so eager to believe that the only thing that counts in their 4 years of study is their academic performance, and that a human commitment is not required.
So, in essence, there's this same amount of detachment and power imbalance in the field of psychotherapy as well. So if psychiatry doesn't help to ameliorate these destructive urges, and certain aspects of psychotherapy exaggerate them and benefit from them, the destructive urges, then something's got to give before we can make progress in actually addressing the root of the violence problem. Because people go to psychiatry, people go to therapy, they, with the unsuspecting, trusting attitude of Kafka's convicted prisoner in their therapist's office, the therapists don't know either, and they're perpetuating some of these same dynamics. So in today's society, there's no way to escape from destructive urges. You just hope they don't burn other people up and burn yourself up with them. We've got to do something more than cross our fingers and curtail freedoms. We've got to learn something here and change something here in the minds of everybody. Even if you haven't internalized institutional, philosophical, cultural violence, or even experience of personal violence and victimization, we've still absorbed the value system enough that we can convince ourselves it's all right to kill these people but not those people. That there is still this just cause out there where it's okay to trespass upon another person with physical violence. Because the people trying to ban guns or trying to limit access to guns, they're not doing much to limit Congress's access to much more destructive implements. They're not doing much to address the fact that the U.S. is the #1 arms dealer in the whole world. There's just this one tiny manifestation of that deep ingrained violence that people are finding so distasteful these days. I find all of it very distasteful. I find all of it unjustified. I'm getting tired of the hypocrisy. That if you want to do something about this problem, then we've got a lot to learn, and we've got to change the way we're doing certain things. And one of those things is not less liberty. Because the illiberal way we treat our children is where these urges come from and where this repression comes from. And something that can only be repressed for so long before it does explode violently, much to no one's surprise. There are basically 4 circumstances in which violence is used.
Yeah, you sent me a link. It's the Dr. David Daniels study.
That's correct.
Okay. Yeah. Well, for those of you who don't know, Dr. Daniels I don't know if he's alive anymore, because this study was 40 years ago. He was a professor at the Department of Psychiatry in Stanford. And this was a study that was produced and dedicated to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Senator Robert F. Kennedy. And it has 23 different authors.
It does. And it was essentially an attempt to answer 6 important questions. First was,
why are we such a seemingly violent species? Number 2, what makes us resort to behaviors ranging from homicide to genocide? Number 3, what are the roots of violence? Number 4, what functions does violence serve? Number 5, how has it been an adaptive behavior? And number 6, what can we do to reduce violence, even end it?
In that study, Dr. Daniels and his cohorts discussed basically 4 circumstances in which violence is used. First one is when
the safety of a person, group, or social structure is threatened. Number 2, when an individual or group's vision of the future seems to disappear and no hope or help seems available. Number 3, when no alternatives are experienced.
And that's what we were talking about earlier with Alice Miller, where if all you experience is violence, all that people experience of you will be violence.
When people lose everything and they have nothing left to lose, they lose it!
It is true. And then number 4 is that
violence can be used as a planned means to a goal.
On the terrorism front, that is circumstance number 4 as a planned means to a goal, in this case a political goal, or a religious goal, or a ideological goal. But with a lot of the homegrown malfeasance, it seems to be, to me, a combination of 1, 2, and 3. That people feel that their personal, group, or social structure that they wish to live in is threatened. And that has distorted people's vision of the future, leaving them seemingly hopeless and helpless. And then the reason we aren't thinking about things rationally and creatively is because so few alternatives have been experienced. When we look at the authority figures that have been paraded in front of us, an unending sea of fools, rarely do we see peaceful mentors, especially not in the political arena. It was very hard to find anyone who would vote against the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I imagine Vietnam was no different. If a person decides to go through life peacefully and without fear, then they will encounter on their journey many Paul Revere types crying about the eventuality of this fear or the eventuality of that fear, and the need for violence against this group or the violence against that group or the need for violence against oneself. They come out of the woodwork. It's very much a part of our national fiber, is certainly violence towards the self, manifest as a violence towards others, and that violence towards the self was learned at a very young age.
Mental health!
He also talks about the evolutionary basis for violence, its adaptive value. 1 would be
providing safety and security for the group. 2, protect the young. 3, assure resources and defend territory. 4, finally maintain social structure and dominant hierarchy.
Violence is it's basic. Like you said, it's not always justified, but it's every human's inherent right. And that's why, like, Clockwork Orange is one of my favorite movies. The great thing about that movie is it makes you question taking away a man's humanity, albeit his violent humanity, and it puts the audience in a very difficult position, because in the beginning of the movie they get to know like a horrible individual, but once his violence is taken away with bizarre mind control experiments, he can't fucking defend himself.
He kind of becomes a sympathetic character.
Absolutely, yeah.
Based on the way everyone's treating him and has treated him, you want him to be able to be alive again in a way. Not necessarily to do all the criminal stuff that him and his droogs were getting up to at the milk bar, but still, symbolically, there's an aspect of humanity lost in the neutering process, which is why neutering isn't what we should be doing. If people have an inherent ability to use force, We need to direct that use of force away from being a violent use of force. Self-defense is not violence to me. Violence to me has a common root with the word violate. The word with it carries a connotation of offensive action and aggression. But self-defense isn't, to me, a violent act. It is a violent act if you're actually not in any jeopardy.
My God, it's coming right for us!
I think that's not exactly what we're talking about here. Another thing about Clockwork Orange is that the programming, the mind control programming and stuff in that movie, that whole field of psychology is very much a successor to the ideas of B.F. Skinner. In that sense, we're all kind of a Manchurian candidate waiting for the right stimuli to send us to our breaking point, at which point, look out world, because we're broken people. How can we put people back together, and how can we prevent them from getting so cracked up in the first place? And I don't think decreasing the individual's liberty to insulate them in a box where no one can do anything to anyone, I don't think that teaches people how to interact nonviolently. It teaches them the fear that without these intrusions, we would just be tearing each other apart. We've got to learn from our conflicts. We've got to learn from our mistakes. We've got to respond to them instead of just reacting to them with this legislation or that legislation. Because that kind of thinking brought us the Patriot Act. It brought us all the post 9/11 legislation that are patently monstrous documents. Let's not double down on foolishness, and let's maybe do a 180 and try to actually get to the root of something before it consumes us all. Like the terrorist problem that wasn't solved 15 years ago. Simply addressing what to do about ISIS is one thing, but if you're not also talking about why is there an ISIS, then you're ignoring the whole conversation. All of these speeches that these presidents give in the wake of a crisis is all about
what I am going to do about this.
It's never about
how did we get here as a people.
How can a government decrease the incidence of violence when government itself uses force and threats of force to accomplish nearly all of its aims? It's one of the two political tools available to a government. Well, three, really. One is the use of force, another is the use of taxation, and the third is subsidy. It's operant conditioning as written by Skinner himself. You have neutral stimuli, you have punishment stimuli, and you have reward stimuli. You play those three notes the right way, you can make people dance. It's going to make people dance, but it's not going to be able to make peace. You can't use violence to create nonviolence. We've been trying it. It's not working.
You can accomplish the same aims of violence through peaceful methods.
Without all the collateral damage. And you can keep the high road so people will actually listen to what you have to say. All these shooters have a manifesto. No one takes anything they say seriously because they were just out caught shooting people. The guy in San Bernardino was arguing with a colleague, I believe, about how the American people are wrong about Islam and how it's a peaceful religion. I agree that it can be a religion for many, many peaceful people. But it sounds like this guy is not the right spokesman for that line of thinking. Because he killed a lot of people. He's probably not the guy that people are going to listen to when they're questioning if whether Islam is really a religion of peace. For this discussion, whether it is or is not a religion of peace is neither here nor there. It's the fact that whatever your goal in the use of violence, you lose the high ground. You lose the ability to influence people on the merit of your principles. If one of your principles is,
yeah, I'll shoot you. You don't agree with me? Here's a bullet.
So if you're going to try to accomplish some end, it's more effective to use peaceful means. On one hand, you'll be alive to see the change you wished to see, and on the other hand, you actually will stand a chance of influencing minds who will influence other minds and spreading a wave of your allegedly good idea. If you have to resort to shooting people, you're pretty much telling the whole world that.
I've got no argument. I'm going to take control of this dialogue with lead.
So yeah, use peace. Use diplomatic shit.
Yeah, to all you mentally ill, crazy fucks out there, there are people out there like Shorts and Jeffrey Homicide who love you, who want you to get out of that, who want you to succeed, not in shooting people, but who want you to get yourself out of that muck that the society that you live in puts you through. Whether it's shoving pills down your mouth or... Shorts, help me out.
Telling you to shut up and be a man and to close off your emotional core to the bitter world around you. Come hang out with us.
Hang out with us.
Come hang out with us and build a better world. Pull the trigger of your love gun. It is, after all, a semi-automatic. Aim your fire at this wheel of death. Break this stupid cycle. Shit.
We stop hitting our kids. We stop using the operant conditioning model of B.F. Skinner in society's affairs. If we stop exporting violence to the world through mass media, then I think we might just get out of this mess. We're going to need to have cooler heads than the ones we've got now, because we're hotheads raised by hotheads.
We'll put relatable links below this podcast for all you parents to look at. Don't abuse your kid, for fuck's sake.
Unless you want him to abuse someone else once you're gone.
And have him be Stalin or Hitler. Do you want that? Do you want that to be your legacy?
Hitler had parents too. Hitler had teachers. Charles Manson almost had parents. Look how well he turned out.
That's interesting. Last time I was at your place, I showed you a video. Initially, it starts out funny, but the journalist asked Charles Manson,
people look at you today, 20 years later, and they still have no idea what you're about. Tell me in a sentence who you are.
And he does a whole series of these like faces. They're very, very theatrical. And he was doing all these various faces, and he just like cut that out, and then he was just himself, and he said,
I'm nobody.
Nobody.
I'm a tramp, a bum, a hobo. I'm a boxcar and a jug of wine. And a straight razor if you get too close to me.
I guess the message he was trying to convey was society has so much fascination with pop culture and who certain people are and, what their stories are and what makes them big, when really they're just people like you and I. They're not gods. They're not idols. He's basically saying that about himself.
Yeah, I think so. And also commenting on the multifaceted nature of each individual human. He had some interesting things to say in between some of his more theatrical performances. He's made some very, very good points in his media exposure. He's a fascinating study because he fits the criteria of what we've been talking about perfectly. He was raised by an abusive mother who may or may not have actually traded him at a bar for a drink. It may be apocryphal, but it also might be true. Then from age 9 until 30, he was in boys' homes or prison. Boys' homes, where he was abused, both physically and sexually, where he was taught violence as a value early on. Then he gets out when he's like 30, 31. Within a year and a half, 2 years, he's tied to a string of grisly murders and ends up back in prison for the rest of his whole life. But if you watch the man and take him in at face value, as I think most people deserve, you see someone with a very agile mind, with a certain charisma that is somewhat impressive. He's been observing people his whole life, and the people he's observed have not been like the people you and I have observed. So what he takes away from those observations is very different than what you and I have taken away from our observations of people. Imagine what could have come of a person with that quickness of mind, that passion of spirit, if he had had a fortunate childhood that didn't involve so much pain. I think he would have contributed to society. It's a picture of what we lose as a society when we turn a blind eye to these dehumanizing factors. In the very little time that Charles Manson spent out of prison, he spent writing acoustic folk songs. He's got an album recorded that people can listen to, and he was talking about, the perception, selfhood, what it means to be a man in today's society. Not today's society, but today, back then. He was a man inquiring into the nature of the world around him. And what he found has left him in prison for his whole adult life and most of his childhood, too. What if we had everyone in jail living up to their idealized version of themselves? We've missed out by letting so many people fall into the wayside of this cultural sickness that is abuse and mistreatment and pain and repression.
What's the album? It's his only one, right?
Yes. It's called Lie. I believe it has an exclamation point at the end of it. The songs are very interesting. He's trying to find something out and express something. There was an outlet there for him that he was denied in jail that contributed to his dark path, so to speak.
Denying him
the right to self-expression through
guitar.
music.
I just want my guitar.
But they don't let him have it in jail.
We saw the interview with Charlie Rose. Then we went from that to that Vice video, and you commented on how he's becoming kind of crazy, which probably has to do with the long solitary confinement that he's going through.
Some people age very gracefully, but people in prison who have lived a life of punishment do not age gracefully. No. The things that keep people healthy are denied in those conditions. Self-expression being one of the most important. You can notice a clear decline in his mental state over the years as a measure of the deprivation he's been forced to endure. They call themselves the correctional department, but they're not correcting shit.
Oh.
They're just moving it. But nobody's pathology has really been corrected in jail unless they've gone the educational route and really done some reckoning on their own self and pursued self-knowledge. The system of corrections in America causes more problems than it fixes. You're going to have to kind of internalize certain values of prison life in order to survive in prison life. And then when you come out of jail for a nonviolent offense, it's a lot harder for you to find a job and put your life on the right path. You are coming out of an institution of criminality where you have more criminal means at your disposal than you did before you went in. You're going to come out a different person with a different outlook on functioning in society if you've spent that much time with criminal element.
Absolutely.
So we just got this seemingly intractable, complex problem that nobody wants to talk about, and there's no will to really get to the bottom of things.
It actually also, like we've been talking about violence, prisons perpetuate violence, because it's like you were saying, basically that's all that they know is when they're in prison, because they just swap stories about crime, they live with crime, they see crime, just violence in there, and that's all they know, and they get out. And you can sort of live in prison, follow the rules, but when you go outside, it's just a whole nother ball game. That's all you're used to.
You learn how to be inside. While you're inside, you don't learn how to be outside. You learn how to survive inside.
Yeah, when they say rehabilitation, it's a fucking joke.
Absolutely, it's a joke. It's a deprivation center, is what it is. Again, it's the operant conditioning of B.F. Skinner, not doing much good. I feel sympathy for these people, too. Perpetrators are also victims. And I think we need to be able to understand that and try to solve problems with empathy instead of
demonizing
people. Yes.
And that's really easy to do, to demonize people. It doesn't take much intellectual muscle to demonize somebody.
No, it does not. We got to see why they happen, not just vilify and lament the fact that they do happen with our hands up in the air saying, somebody do something. You can't help people until you can rehumanize them. Especially people who have been dehumanized by others and have thus dehumanized themselves. How are you going to help them by continuing to dehumanize them? You've got to rehumanize them and bring their empathy system online so then they can proceed through life without perpetuating the carnage they've experienced.
I've had enough of dance halls. I've had enough of pills. I've had enough of street fights. I've seen my share of kills. I'm finished with the fashions. And acting like I'm tough. I'm bored with hate and passion. I've had enough of trying to love.
It's these trigger words, these talismanic trigger words that people know. That's terrorist, mass shooter, lone wolf, guns. These senseless killings.
They're only senseless if you stopped thinking about why. Because the trail makes sense, actually. But it's an uncomfortable sense. And we need the will to make sense of the things that are difficult to make sense of. Or else we're just going to have to get used to them. Or we're going to have to put the entire world in a padded cage where nothing dangerous can happen. We want to turn college into daycare. We want to turn most spheres of American life into sterile prison. And we want everyone else in straitjackets so they can't use their arms in ways that we don't appreciate.
And this is what we've been talking about all night, essentially, is just the masses seem to be lazy in examining the human condition and why people act the way we act. There's a Sufi poem, or not a Sufi poem, but a Sufi tale. Are you familiar with Idris Shah? He's put out this book called Learning How to Learn, Psychology and Spirituality in the Sufi Way. One of the tales that he puts in the book is called Shibli and the Stones.
In a famous instance recorded in the Al-Hay-Nama of Hakim Sinai, the Sufi teacher Shibli of Khorasan made this self-deception a matter of illustration, teaching, in a dramatic event which he initiated. Because of his extravagant utterances, disliked by the authorities, Shibli was chained up as a madman. A number of people who respected him went to him on a visit, inquiring about his welfare. He asked them who they considered themselves to be, and they answered that they were his friends. At this, Shibli hurled stones at them, and they ran away. Shibli shouted, "You say that you are my friends, thinking of me, but I have shown you that you flee from my affliction, and hence you are concerned not for me, but for your own protection from stones."
I guess what I took from it is it's painful to do some introspection, not only on yourself, but about society and why we do the things that we do. Be prepared to have some pain and have some stones hurled at you. It's not an easy process, but it's necessary, and it takes time on your part. I know we have other things going on, but don't just demonize people.
Please. Especially in a thing like violence, where the transition from being a victim of violence to being a perpetrator of violence is very common. When I see a perpetrator of violence, I'm also seeing a victim of violence, and I feel for that part of that person. That part of that person who never got to really do with life what they wanted to do. Kids are not aspiring to leave bodies cold on the pavement. That's not what childhood dreams are made of. That's what adult perversion settles for. And there's something that happens to us when we're young that makes us become this when we are old, or at least mature. We can't take the mental shortcut and say, I don't really want to think about the root causes of this. I'm just going to let Joe Biden take care of it. Joe freaking Biden?
Joey the Shock? Yeah, we're not asking you to be a social worker.
People who have been treated violently treating people violently.
Hope we're not too didactic here.
It makes sense for us to be didactic here because what we're talking about is what we're not being didactic about in a way. What we're talking about is what people have not been taught or instructed or shown how to do. And there's no way to change what people haven't been shown without trying to show them. So a didactic approach here is a result of generations of not being didactic about peaceful parenting, peaceful relationships with the world around us, and fostering a well-adjusted community.
Right. We're going to beat this horse even more. The third piece that we're going to bring up on this whole issue of violence is called the violence triangle by a fellow by the name of Johann Galtung. It's basically something that classifies different types of violence. Why don't you tell us a little bit about it?
Well, the reason it's called a triangle is because it's got 3 points. One point is what is known as structural violence. Another point is direct violence, which is person-to-person violent behavior. And then we've got cultural violence. Cultural violence means those aspects of culture, the symbolic sphere of our existence, that can be used to justify or legitimize direct or structural violence. What is meant by structural violence is when the violence is actually built into the structure and shows up as unequal power, power differentials, and sometimes consequently as unequal life chances. We need to understand more about structural violence and cultural violence if we're going to be able to understand direct violence. But the approach that our society seems to be set on is the direct violence only part of the triangle. We are ignoring the structural violence. We're ignoring the cultural violence that legitimizes violent norms and attitudes in society. And we're just focusing on direct violence because that's the one that involves curtailing civil liberties most directly. If you attempt to address and limit structural violence, you're going to be limiting the government's liberties. And if you address cultural violence and understand cultural violence, then you'll be limiting the media's liberties and certain cultural forces' ability to manipulate through double standards regarding the use of violence. So when we only attempt to understand one of 3 parts of a discussion or of a concept, we're only going to get 1/3 of the way into understanding it, if that. And I don't think partial understanding is how problems like this are most adequately addressed. You need a holistic understanding of the causes, the roots, the worldview, and the pathologies involved. And yes, the New York Times, the motives.
Limiting media violence, that's interesting.
Well, the media is not blameless in any of this. Media gives such a platform to these egregious psychopaths that there's no real wonder in why people are starting to kill each other for political reasons more and more often. It's because that's the only way to get everyone to read your stupid manifesto.
The suspect tweeted his manifesto.
I mean, that just annoys me.
They're going to talk about you for days. A week ago, they didn't even know your name, couldn't care less about you. That's part of the appeal.
Kind of the same story that's beaten over after every shooting is they bring out the parents or friends after the shooting, and it's like, oh, we didn't know our son was such a lunatic. Well, no, the whole world knows that he's a mass murdering psychopath, but you didn't know? You didn't know that?
The reason you didn't know it is because they learned it under your supervision. A psychopath relative to his parents aren't really that psychopathic because there's a clear delineation in cause. But to people not of that pathology, it's immediately apparent. Or maybe, if not immediately, within 6 months of knowing a person, 6 to 9 months, you know what you need to know about how a person operates under duress, what their vision is for the world, how they treat other people. There's a quote in here of the violence triangle. That violence, whether direct or structural, is a human phenomenon. As such, it poses for human beings not only a physical or existential problem, but also a problem of meaning. Both types of violence, therefore, need to be justified or legitimated in one form or another. This occurs in the arena of culture, in the realm of beliefs, attitudes, and symbols. It would be erroneous to say that culture is the root cause of violence, since the causal influence runs bilaterally among the 3 corners of the violence triangle. Yet neither direct or structural violence can go on for long without at least some support for the culture. In any given culture, the justification or legitimation of violence can come from a variety of directions, most significantly from religion, ideology, and cosmology, but also from the arts and sciences. I think that says it quite adequately.
Where do you think it's the most complicit?
Media is a big one. I think religion, ideology, and cosmology are one part of the same tree, in a way. because a religion is kind of an ideology and a cosmology. A cosmology lends itself to religion and ideologies that stem from that cosmology.
Yeah.
And you can't really have a cosmology without an ideology. So it's hard to separate any of those from the others. But I definitely think it comes more from religion, ideology, and cosmology than it does the arts and the sciences.
Would you say that popping pills is a huge part of the culture? That's a culture in itself, because with the whole Alice Miller, she was talking about how we put people through schools and it makes them machines. You know, drugs is a big part of making a human being a machine.
Or sustaining the output of that machine.
Absolutely.
To me, psychiatric pharmaceutical drugs are a manifestation of the imbalance we're all experiencing. Well-adjusted people don't take this amount of Effexor, for example. It's another manifestation of the problem, and it's a manifestation of the problem that actually contributes to the problem in the use of these MAOI and SSRI drugs.
There's a great documentary that I would recommend everybody to watch by this guy named Adam Curtis called The Trap. They get into the drugs and mind control and all that as far as pushing people into being more machine than man, into the heart of like the economic model, to keep the economic model going as opposed to who you are just as a person.
Sure, the loss of selfhood. In The Trap, he talks a little bit about some of the anti-psychiatry psychiatrists, people like R.D. Laing. He also talks about economists like Hayek.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the people that he interviews are from accredited universities, like John Hopkins.
And most people, don't know who R.D. Laing is because he's critical of a lot of the orthodoxy in mental health. He's more of an existential philosopher who uses that understanding to help patients. He's not like a public figure that most people go to.
Would he classify himself as a psychiatrist?
Yes.
Yeah, that's kind of like who I'd want to actually go to if I ever wanted like psychotherapy. I wouldn't want anybody who would recommend any kind of medication or anything. Obviously, you can refuse that, but like when a psychiatrist recommends you get on medication, the only thing that I could think is that this person is lazy and does not want to talk. So that's somebody like R.D. Laing is somebody I would want to go to.
Yeah.
I just don't know if there's anybody like that here. I mean, I'm sure there is, but where the fuck can you find somebody like that?
I'm sure it's not easy. There's a school of mental health practitioners and inquirers known as existential psychology. They're out there. They're hard to find, but they're the people who actually talk about the roots of problems on an existential basis that everyone else is quick to prevent people from investigating. So anyone who's feeling a bit bent out of shape these days and is looking for someone to talk to, consider the existential psychologists and therapists instead of the pharmaceutical ones. It's worth thinking about.
It's worth thinking about, especially if you want to be a threat to society, an existential threat.
The kind of threats that make it to old age, though. And we don't want to end up in the Skinner box. So we've got to respect the dignity of human life, the dignity of our own life, but we've still got to be a threat to society.
A gardener going into an orchard looks at the trees. He knows that this one is a date, that one a fig, the other one a pomegranate, a pear, or an apple. To do this, he does not have to see the fruit, only the trees.